The agency disclosure form. The agency disclosure form is required by the Ohio Division of Real Estate on all transactions, with very, very few exceptions. It is required in commercial transactions as well as residential. The form is to be generated by the buyer's agent or listing agent if the buyer is a customer or if you're practicing sub-agency. So it starts with the person making the offer. So in this case, 99% of the time it will be the buyer's agent. In one of those few instances where the listing agent and seller are preparing an offer to present to a buyer, then of course they would generate the form. The buyer is to sign the agency disclosure no later than when the offer is prepared. The buyer's agent is to deliver the agency disclosure executed by the buyer to the seller's agent with the offer, if the seller is unrepresented, directly to the seller. It will be signed by the seller before an offer can be presented to them. Now, it's up to the buyer's agent to indicate the accurate agency relationships. Is it two agents from different brokerages? That would be a co-broke. That is Section 1, the very first area that we'll look at that in a minute. Is it two agents from the same brokerage, but they're representing different clients, one representing the buyer, one representing the seller? And finally, the third section applies to when there's only one agent, or in the case of our office, a team, either practicing dual agency or representing only one client, and the other is a customer. Now, if you're the listing agent and you receive an offer without an agency disclosure, according to Ohio law, it's no different than a verbal offer, and you can't present the written offer. You can tell your seller about it, but you do not have a written offer to present, because the law says you must have your seller sign the agency disclosure before presenting an offer to them. Now, here's why this is important. If you fail to follow the law about agency disclosure, it's prima facie evidence of a violation of Ohio license law, punishable by a fine, education, suspension, even if it's terribly wrong, revocation of your license. So this is a very important form. There are a couple exceptions to the agency disclosure requirements. If it's a rental or lease of residential premises that can be performed in 18 months or less, you don't have to have this. So apartment managers aren't using the agency disclosure all the time. If it's an outgoing referral, if you are referring a prospective purchaser or seller to another licensee and you won't be providing the services to them, you don't need the agency disclosure. Incoming referrals, of course, you must have the agency disclosure. Transactions involving foreign real estate, which is any real estate that's outside of Ohio, doesn't mean a lot to us, but if you were on one of the border cities, let's say like in Maumee, up close to Michigan, many of those agents are licensed in both Michigan and Ohio. When they're doing business in Michigan, you don't need the Ohio form. And finally, the sale of cemetery lots or burial rights. That's also controlled by the division, but if you're selling a cemetery lot, you don't need an agency disclosure. So let's look at the agency disclosure statement. This is an agency form given to us by the Ohio Division of Real Estate. We cannot change the form, we can't personalize it, we can't put our logos on it. It carries the great State of Ohio seal and the Fair Housing logo. We can't have our own logos on them. So what do we do? How do we fill this out as a buyer's agent? Well, it's important that your buyer understand what this form does. That it's required by Ohio law. Simply by signing, you are not obligated to pay the agent's brokerage. Instead, the purpose of this form is to confirm that you have been advised of the role of the agents in the transaction below. So we begin by filling out the address. In this case, it's 123 Main Street, Anytown, Ohio 12345. Our buyers, if you remember, are good old George and Martha Washington. And you have gotten the seller's name off the tax and legal from the listing agent. They're James and Dolly Madison. If you don't know what the seller's name is, or you aren't sure who has the authority to sell, it's perfectly okay to leave this area blank. As a listing agent, if this information is incorrect, feel free to change it. If it's actually going to be signed, let's say it's James and Dolly Madison, but it's going to be signed by William Madison, executor, you can add that information. Make sure it is correct, however. Now, if this is a co-broke transaction, that is a transaction involving two agents in different brokerages. This is the area you're going to sign. So in this case, you will put your name. If you're part of a team, make sure every name of the people who are involved in the transaction is there. If you happen to be a husband and wife, like Andy and I are, make sure both names are there, and the brokerage. Now, unfortunately, there's not room here to write Keller Williams Greater Cleveland Southeast, and Ohio law does not permit you to abbreviate your brokerage, so we suggest you do KW Greater Cleveland Southeast. The seller will be represented by, these are the co-broke agent or agents, and their brokerage. In this case, let's say it's Cupcake Real Estate. Now, if the other agent, if you're the listing agent, again, let's get into being the listing agent, and all they do, let's say you're getting an offer from Cupcake, and all they do is write Keller Williams here, you need to correct it and make sure we get into Greater Cleveland Southeast. That's your responsibility. But we'll leave this at Cupcake Real Estate. Now, if you are doing a deal with another agent in our brokerage, and only another agent in our brokerage, you will go to Section 2, and you're going to fill out Keller Williams Greater Cleveland Southeast, and you will say, so-and-so, your name, you work for the buyer, and your colleague works for the seller. We will never ever in this brokerage use the second one. That's only for a special type of brokerage that we do not practice. The third type of event that might happen is you are the only agent, or your team has the whole thing. So in this case, it's your name, and again, we're going to default to the KW Greater Cleveland Southeast. Now, we are never dual agents, so you will never use this section. We will always be here. In most cases, it will be you representing the seller, and the other party is going to be unrepresented. If you're representing the seller, the buyer is a customer, you are to complete the unrepresented buyer agreement with the buyer. Sometimes, let's say you're selling a FSBO, you represent the buyer. In that case, it will be the unrepresented seller agreement. It's very important that this area is done correctly. A common error, You might have an agent. It should be filled up here because it's Keller Williams, Greater Cleveland, Southwest. You're doing one with someone from the Strongsville office. But they just filled out Keller Williams, or in the worst case, they just put Keller Williams here and fill this section out. If they have done that, put it down here and think you're both in the same brokerage, send it back to them, have them correct it because their buyer has agreed to an erroneous type of agency. We're going to want to be sure that it is filled out correctly. So that's your job to make sure it is. If it's simply correcting your brokerage name, it's in the right area, you're fine, go with it. Otherwise, send it back. Now, when you receive it, you should have your buyer sign here, end date. It is important that it's dated. .loop does that for you. If you're the listing agent, whatever type of agency it is, sign here. Of course, you're only going to fill out one of the transaction types. One, co-broke. Two agents in this agency, in our brokerage. 3, you're the only agent or your team is the only group involved. And that way you'll only fill out this section here. It's important to note page 1 of 2. This is a 2-page form. If you have signed off on a transaction involving 2 agents in the same brokerage, or you're the only agent, even a customer relationship because of management level dual agency, it's important to go over the second page. As a dual agent, this doesn't apply to us ever, but the part about the brokerage does apply. Let them know what the brokerage will do. The brokerage will be compensated per the agency agreement. Talks about management licensees, the responsibilities of all party, and that by signing on the reverse side, you acknowledge that you have read and understand this form and giving voluntary informed consent to the agency relationship disclosed. The division says if you have any questions, call us. It's a good idea, especially if you are in Section 2 or Section 3. Have your buyer's initial. If you're the listing agent, have your seller's initial.